Over the last 50 years or so, something absolutely fundamental changed in the American economy. You see, a long stretch of shared prosperity just sort of vanished. And in its place, we got an era of really staggering inequality. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into that huge shift. We'll be drawing on Timothy Noah's comprehensive series to understand what happened, why it happened, and maybe most importantly, why it matters to all of us. Okay, this chart right here, this is the heart of our mystery. Just look at that dramatic U-shape. On the left side, you can see inequality falling after the Great Depression, which led into this long, pretty stable period that economists call the Great Compression. But then, look what happens right around 1979. The curve just swings sharply upward. That's it. That's the Great Divergence. And the central question we're investigating is, what on earth caused this massive, society-altering change? So, to get to the bottom of this whole thing, we're going to break our investigation into 6 parts. First, we'll lay out these 2 very different eras. Then, we'll round up the usual suspects. You know, the common explanations you always hear. We'll weigh some more complex evidence, explore a really big shift in political and economic power, and then we'll zero in on who benefited the most. And finally, we'll ask the big one. Does any of this even matter? All right, first up, a tale of 2 eras. Before we can really understand the Great Divergence, we have to look at the period that came right before it, a time when the American economy looked and honestly felt very, very different. This timeline really puts it all into perspective. Way back in 1915, people were already pretty worried about a new class of super rich when the top 1% took home about 18% of the nation's income. Then came the Great Compression, this almost 40-year stretch where, for the most part, incomes grew together. But starting around 1979, everything flipped. By 2007, the top 1% was pulling in an even bigger slice of the pie, 24%, which is even more than they did back in the age of the Rockefellers and Carnegies. And this is a really crucial point. According to Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, this isn't some small statistical quirk. Get this, from 1980 to 2005, more than 80% of the total increase in American incomes went to the top 1%. That's a shift so massive that most people don't even notice its full scale in their day-to-day lives. So, what caused it? Well, in any good investigation, you start with the most common theories. Let's take a look at the usual suspects often blamed for economic inequality and see if the evidence actually holds up. First up, the gender pay gap. It's a huge issue of economic fairness, absolutely. But could it be the main thing driving this specific 40-year trend of rising inequality? You know, what's surprising is that the evidence actually points in the complete opposite direction. During the Great Divergence, the gender pay gap actually shrank by nearly half. As you can see here, women were moving into higher-skilled, higher-paying jobs way more rapidly than men. So while pay inequity is definitely still an issue, women's progress in the economy actually worked against this trend of rising inequality, not for it. Okay, next suspect. What about the racial income gap? Now, if this were the main driver, you'd expect the gap between Black and white families to have gotten way bigger after 1979. So, did it? The data here tells a story of stagnation, not divergence. The income gap between Black and white families is roughly the same today as it was back in 1979. Now, that lack of progress is a deeply troubling problem all on its own. But because the gap didn't really grow during this period, it just can't be the primary engine of this huge new wave of inequality. Okay, so with the most common suspects ruled out, our investigation has to dig a little deeper. Let's move on and see how 2 other powerful forces, immigration and technology, hold up under a closer look. The story of immigration is, well, it's complicated. On one hand, you've got economists like George Borjas who argue that, yeah, on a national level, it does put some downward pressure on wages for the least educated native-born workers. But on the other hand, a lot of studies that look at specific cities often find little to no impact at all. So here's the bottom line. While immigration is a factor for the very bottom of the income ladder, its effect just isn't big enough to explain the giant chasm that opened up across the entire economy. It's a contributor, but it's not the main story. This brings us to technology, and specifically to computers. The theory goes that computerization basically hollowed out the middle of the economy. It got rid of routine middle-class jobs, think bank tellers, typists, while at the same time creating more demand at the very top for highly skilled professionals and at the bottom for low-skilled service jobs. There's a name for this. It's called job polarization. But here's the problem with blaming everything on the microchip. First off, the Great Divergence was already getting started in the late 1970s, before personal computers were on every desk. And second, Europe went through the exact same technological shift, the same job polarization, but they didn't see anywhere near the same explosion in inequality. So while technology is clearly part of the story, it can't be the whole explanation. Something else was going on that made the US different. And this is where our investigation takes a crucial turn. We're now looking at the role of government, the policies it chose to enact, and the shifting balance of power between people who work for a living and the people who own the capital. Now, this next piece of evidence shows a really striking correlation. A political scientist, Larry Bartels, analyzed income growth all the way from 1948 to 2005. And his data shows that for the bottom 80% of families, their incomes grew significantly faster under Democratic presidents. Under Republican presidents, they grew much more slowly, while incomes at the top just kept on climbing. Now, this is what you'd call circumstantial evidence, but it's a powerful suggestion that the policy choices made in the White House had a really profound impact on who got to share in the country's economic growth. And a huge piece of that policy puzzle is the decline of organized labor. See, back in the post-war era, strong unions helped create something called the Treaty of Detroit, where workers were basically guaranteed a share of any productivity gains. This set a wage standard even for companies that weren't unionized. But starting with the Taft-Hartley Act and then really speeding up in the 1980s, policies shifted against labor. And as union power crumbled, so did one of the key institutions that had kept wages more equal for decades. But the Great Divergence isn't just a story about the middle getting hollowed out. To really understand it, we have to look way, way up the ladder, to the very, very top, where the changes have been the most extreme. By digging through tax data, the economists Emmanuel Saz and Thomas Piketty realized that the rich isn't just one big group. There's the top 10%, the sort of rich. Then there's the top 1%, the rich. And then you have the top 0.1%, a tiny slice earning over $1 million a year, who the source material calls the stinking rich. And this is where the divergence becomes truly breathtaking. Just look at these numbers. Since 1979, the income share of the top 1% more than doubled. But for the top 0.1%, their share of the nation's income nearly quadrupled. This insane concentration of wealth right at the very top is a phenomenon that really sets the United States apart from pretty much every other developed country. So who are these winners, and how did this happen? Well, two key drivers really stand out. First, a huge wave of financial deregulation let Wall Street's share of all corporate profits explode from under 10% to over 40%. At the exact same time, the pay for top corporate executives just skyrocketed, and it often became totally disconnected from how well their companies were even doing. Okay, so we've investigated how this happened. We've weighed the evidence, and we've pointed to the primary causes. But this leaves us with the final, and I think most important question of all. So what? Why should any of us care about the Great Divergence? Economist Finis Welch identifies a really critical tipping point. He says inequality becomes destructive when people just lose faith in the system, when they start to believe that hard work doesn't actually pay off, and that the whole American dream of upward mobility is just impossible. It eats away at the fundamental belief in fairness that holds a society together. And the stakes are just incredibly high. According to the source material, extreme inequality isn't just an economic issue. Some economists now believe it's what fueled the massive consumer debt that led to the 2008 financial crisis. Politically, it creates these deep social divisions that make finding common ground almost impossible. And on a fundamental level, it just frays the social fabric. It undermines the very idea of America as a place where, out of many, we are one. We've followed the evidence to understand this 40-year story of how the American economy basically came apart. We've seen the causes, everything from policy choices to the rise of a new financial aristocracy. This investigation shows us how we got here. The crucial question it leaves us with is, where does this divergence lead us next?